Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Dr. Kirsten Hochmiller from the Department of Government and International Studies program. I want to welcome you to a panel which unfortunately has become even more pressing, urgent, and vital than when we first conceived of it, like last April, May of this year, with regard to the emerging and growing threats to press freedom around the world. And this was way before we knew of Mr. Khashoggi in this context, as many of you were following the news. And often, as so happens, while that is an extraordinarily dramatic case, it's not limited to that particular context alone. So Freedom House, which is a very significant player in this sector and who Dr. Deutsch Karlekar has worked with extensively, there's a quote in the online program, I think it's really relevant to mention here. Press freedom is facing new threats in major democracies as well as in repressive states. So one of the things is that I think we often treat this threat, this challenge, as being something that happens in other places and that happens particularly in more authoritarian leading countries. But that is certainly no longer the dynamic that we are, and trend that we are seeing. Where authorities are focusing their efforts on social media and other online platforms after subduing the independence of major print and broadcast outlets. So we are really pleased and honored today to have Dr. Karin Deutsch Karlekar from Penn, which if any of you who are in writing and journalism know, is one of the great voices that really tries to draw light and attention to these kinds of issues. Dr. Deutsch Karlekar is the director of PEN America's Freedom Expression at Risk programs. She focuses on global free expression, artistic freedom, press freedom, and digital rights issues, and leads PEN's assistance to individuals at risk as a result of their expression. Prior to joining PEN, she served from 2001 to 2015 as director of Freedom House's production of the flagship annual report that tracks trends in global media freedom and rates of every country in the world. It's an incredible index that I would really encourage you to refer to and some of the interests that you might have along these lines. As well as acting as an expert spokesperson on press freedom issues at conferences, meetings, and in media appearances, Dr. Karlekar has developed index methodologies and conducted training sessions on press freedom, internet freedom, freedom of expression, and monitoring dangerous speech, authored a number of special reports and academic papers, and conducted research, assessment, and advocacy missions to Nigeria, South Africa, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Myanmar, from which you more recently returned. I'd love to see your passport, as the students tell me, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Dr. Deutsch Karlekar is going to give a more formal PowerPoint slide deck presentation at the beginning, but she very much is very enthusiastic and welcoming of having a discussion. In the latter part, I have made her aware that we also have a class transition at the end. And then for any of you who would not be part of the government INTL listserv, I want to bring to your attention that after this session ends at 2:25, I believe, we are going to be remaining in this room, and Dr. Deutsch Karlekar has very kindly agreed, because she has some live time before catching her train back home, to stay on and talk about her job. So it's a job talk for those of you who might have kind of professional development interest, questions about her journey to the current position, some of the rewards and challenges. So that will continue after we make a transition. We'll go directly into that. That will last about 45 minutes or so. So all of you are, even if you're not looking for a job, are more than welcome to stay there. That'll have a more informal feel to it. So I'm going to do to extend that invitation to all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Karin Deutsch Karlekar from Penn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that great introduction. I was going to start off my talk with a video to sort of draw attention to some of the issues. This is a video that we produced about the case of two imprisoned Reuters journalists in Myanmar. And PEN America awarded them our major award this year, the Freedom to Write Award in May. And we produced this video in conjunction with Reuters to sort of highlight their case. So I wanted to start it off with the video to sort of draw us all into the issues.
They're used to it for me. Sorry.
Oh my God. Sorry about that. What I wanted to do. That's all right.
Hit the maximize.
That's what happens when you're 25 years old. Okay.
It's good. It's good.
Okay, sorry about that.
Just made it lighter.
December 12th, Walon and Jose were in our bureau. They were working. They received a call from a police official who said that he wanted to meet.
The driver had waited outside for them. After a few hours, they had come out, so he went and looked for them, and they weren't there anymore.
The text that Walon sent to me was just one line. I have been arrested.
ဒီဇင်ဘာ12ရက်နေ့ညပေါ့နော်အဲ့မှာတော့ပျောက်သွားရဲဆိုတာသိလိုက်တယ်။ဘယ်လိုအနေအထားမျိုးနဲ့ပျောက်သွားတာလဲ။ဘာကြောင့်လဲဆိုတာကိုကတော့မသိခဲ့ဘူး။
ရှုံးကြတယ်ကအမျိုးဟိုမှာပုံစံတယ်ပေါ့အဲ့လိုပုံစံတော့ဒီမှာရေကိုကျော်စိုးချာလို့တယ်ပေါ့နော်ကိုကျော်ယူမတဲ့ခံစားရတာပေါ့
Up in Rakhine State, near the border with Bangladesh, there had been a huge exodus of Rohingya Muslims, a minority group. Nearly 700,000 have been forced out. Walon and Choseyo started reporting on one very specific case, the massacre of 10 Rohingya men, and how they'd been rounded up by the military and the police, and then essentially summarily executed.
We chose Walon and Chow Sau-u because of their courage in digging out the truth about a story that the Myanmar government and military wants desperately to suppress. These are facts that they don't want known, and Walon and Chow Sau-u reported the story from all of its angles.
I think it sends a very bad signal that doing legitimate journalism is a crime.
At Reuters, we have trust principles that hold us to independence, integrity, and freedom from bias.
အဲ့အချိန်မှာကိုဝင်ရှိနေရတဲ့ကိုဝင်ရှိမှန်းတော့မသိခဲ့ဘူး။ဒီဆရာဝန်မနဲ့တော့ပြရတယ်ဆိုလူတိုင်းကကိုယောက်ျားနဲ့တော့ကြတယ်လေ။ကိုကတော့ကိုတယောက်ပဲပေါ့။
မာနေစာအုပ်ခတ်တယ်အဲ့လိုပဲငွေချင်းတွေလည်းပြည့်ပြည့်သားများလည်းမရှိဘူးပြီးတော့အရန်လေးအေးတွေကအရန်နေနေတဲ့ စာအုပ်တွေပဲညီမတို့သိရတော့သူကဗျာနေတယ်စာတွေနေတယ်
English စာတွေတင်ပေးနေရနောက်စာကြည့်လိုက်လို့စာအုပ်တွေကယူပေးနေလို့ပြောပါတယ်
သူလက်ထက်ခက်ရတာမျိုးကသမီးယောက်ျားကိုဘယ်လိုမျိုးကူညီကြတယ်လို့ကြီးလို့များတယ်မှာလေသမီးကတော့သမီးယောက်ျားကိုအမြဲဆုံးလုပ်ပြအောင်ကူညီပေးကြပါပဲ
It's very moving to me to think about what it must be like for them to be in prison, separated from their families, not able to do their work. I mean, it's crushing to imagine that.
Borders is entirely committed to supporting Walloon and Chasolu. We believe they should be freed from prison, that they've done nothing wrong, and it's time for them to be out there reporting again.
38 of the 42 writers and journalists who've been honored by this award have been freed within an average of about 18 months, in part because of the publicity and the pressure that mount as a result of the award.
I see the icon. Thank you. So we'll and then I would just forget. There you go.
So I'm going to try and give a bit of an overview about sort of the state of global press freedom at the moment, some of the main threats to journalists and media outlets, looking at some of the main challenges, both the obvious threats like murders and legal cases against journalists, but also some of the not so obvious threats such as economic pressure, online harassment, and the growing trend of sort of misinformation and fake news. And then I'll close with a few of I'm just highlighting some of the individual cases that PEN is working on, just to focus on some of the individuals at risk that we help with. I'll start with a lot of data and graphs from Freedom House. I used to, as Kirsten mentioned, I did work there and I ran the Press Freedom Project there for 14 years. So I still feel like this is a bit my baby, even though I don't manage it anymore. But just to give a bit of an overview, and to sort of put what's going on, I think, in the US media into perspective and look at the global trends. So in terms of looking at sort of first a definition and what Freedom House looks at, and what I still think of when I'm sort of trying to explain media freedom, we look at it both in terms of the ability of journalists to impart news and information without the fear of repercussions for doing their work. But we also look at the ability of people in each country, the sort of consumer, to access a range of news and information, which is vital for them to make informed decisions, be it about politics, be it about things going on in their local communities, anything. So we're both looking at it from the point of view of the producer and the consumer. What Freedom House found in its latest global rating, which was released in the spring of 2017, so the data is about a year old, but things really haven't changed too much on a global level. I would say probably they've only gotten worse in the last year, honestly. What they found last year was that the level of global press freedom had declined to its lowest point in 13 years. There were, as Kirsten mentioned, there have been unprecedented threats to the media in major democracies. including the US, Hungary, Poland, Philippines, and South Africa. There have been new moves by sort of the traditional authoritarian governments to, such as Russia and China, to extend level of media control both within their borders and also outside their borders. And then there have been cases in a number of key countries where governments are using broader political and social unrest as an excuse to justify crackdowns on the press. So this happened a year and a half ago in Turkey, where there was a coup attempt, and in the wake of that, the government initiated sort of an unprecedented crackdown in Turkey to the point where Turkey now jails more journalists than any other country in the world. Looking at the overall data that Freedom House provides, only 13% of the world's population enjoy a free media environment, while 45% live in countries where media are rated not free. And the population factors are obviously skewed largely by China, which has a huge population and is rated not free, as well as India, which is rated partly free. So the population, I think, is a little bit, the numbers are worse than if you look at, the breakdown by number of countries, which we'll get into. Looking at sort of free countries, what we're looking at there is countries where the coverage of political news is robust, where the safety of journalists is guaranteed, and there are no onerous legal or economic pressures on media. So this is the ideal situation, but one, again, which only 13% of the world currently enjoys. This is the latest map, just so you can see sort of graphically in graphic form how it's broken down around the world. The green countries are rated free. The yellow is rated free, and purple is not free. So that's sort of a graphical global analysis. If you look at the regional trends, the Eurasian region, which is much of the former Soviet Union, continues to have the worst record for press freedom. Regimes there exert almost total control over the press, and there are very few independent sources of news. The Middle East is sort of the second worst by region in terms of the scoring. There are ongoing conflicts which have led to very bad pressures and scores in a number of countries, and then ongoing government crackdowns in a number of key countries, including Bahrain, Egypt, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. The Asia Pacific, I would say, as well as Africa, have very mixed records, where some countries perform very well and others perform very badly, and a very wide range of different media environments. What we have seen in Asia is an increase in laws to silence online critics. We've seen this particularly in Myanmar, which we can talk more about later. And then China continues to have some of the harshest penalties for cracking down on the press. What we've seen in a couple of major African countries in the last year or two is media freedom basically coming under pressure from embattled leaders who are trying to stay in power. And so are really cracking down on the press as they attempt to try and win elections that are often being conducted on an unequal playing field. The Americas is the second freest region overall, but there does continue to be sort of a major problem in certain countries with particularly physical violence and murders being directed at members of the press, and Mexico remains a particular problem in this area. There have been at least 6 murders this past year, in 2018. And Europe traditionally has been the freest region, but again, it's not something that can be taken for granted. Many politicians, particularly in the sort of new members of Europe and the former Eastern Bloc, have been actively eroding trust in the media and have been sort of contributing to backsliding in countries such as Hungary or Poland. So none of this can be taken for granted, unfortunately. If you look at sort of historical trends over time, the Freedom House numbers are really fantastic because they go back to 1980, so you have a really long data set, and you can really track some of these trends over time. So both the Freedom House Press Freedom Report and the Demand Freedom in the World Report, which covers general human rights issues, are really, I would say, great resources used a lot by academics and by students to sort of do data correlations and to look at some of these trends over time. What you see is that the fall of the Soviet Union really brought about a huge change in the level of media freedom. So if you look at the situation in the mid-'80s, the vast majority of countries were in the not free category, in the purple category. By the time you get to the mid-'90s, it's really evened out, and there's a very even balance in the number of countries in each category. And sort of the high point was then, the mid-2000s, I would say, in terms of countries being in the free category. What we've seen actually since then is a sort of backsliding among more free, open, democratic environments. and many of those countries have actually sort of erased or eroded the gains that they previously made. So many sort of new democracies in the former Soviet bloc have slipped backwards. We've also seen major backsliding in other countries that used to be quite democratic and now are not, such as Thailand and Southeast Asia. So there has been, I would say, it's interesting, the number in the not-free category has remained steady, but we have seen a lot of erosion in countries where the press was free and we felt that sort of no more work needed to be done. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And then this is sort of the trend line over the last 13 years. So it's been pretty much a steep and steady decline in the level of press freedom around the world as measured by Freedom House. And this is actually tracked with their other index, which measures democracy in general. So actually press freedom started declining first, and then was followed by declines in democracy and human rights as a whole. Just in case you're interested in the best and worst performers on the index, this is the most free countries, and surprisingly, mostly in Scandinavia, and then the least free, North Korea pretty much always remains in the top position. Several countries in Eurasia and Eritrea and Crimea, which is a territory that is being rated separately now by Freedom House. The U.S. is currently ranked 37th and has slipped, I'd say, several places down since in the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years. So turning now to sort of some of the analysis of the different types of ways the media are pressured. Some are, I would say, more obvious and some are less. So we try and look not just at pressure by the government or authorities in each country. Obviously, heads of state or other major political leaders can play a major role in setting the tone by, for example, if they're launching verbal attacks or lawsuits against the press, then that really sets the tone from the top for other, members of the government and or the general public to also attack journalists. But there's also, and security forces can play a major role in terms of harassing, arresting, or beating up journalists. But what we also are looking at is non-state actors, so trolls that can be abusing or threatening journalists and writers online. We can look at violent groups such as terrorist groups or ethnic militias, criminal gangs that can also be involved in major forms of violence against journalists. We look at the legal system and sort of how well judges either obey the law, don't obey the law, and how they go after journalists. And we also look at the impact of media owners and how that can have an impact on censoring actually what the journalists themselves are writing. So there's many different forms of pressure. Some are much more obvious, such as the murder of a journalist, and some are much more subtle. Looking at journalists killed, and now I'll turn the next few slides to really great data, which is pulled together by the Committee to Protect Journalists every year. They pull very good data and have for a number of years, both on the number of journalists killed and also the number of journalists that are in jail around the world. So you'll see basically from 1992 till 2018, this doesn't take into account a couple of murders in the last few weeks, but 1,323 journalists have been killed in that period. So it's a pretty high number if you look over that period, and it's there's ups and downs, but it's been fairly steady in terms of the numbers. Some years you may have blips because of a really big attack or a war or very bad situation in one country, but generally what we can see is that the level has remained bad, and I would say that it was better in the mid-90s and early 2000s and has increased in more recent years. So far this year we've had 44 journalists killed, and again this doesn't include the 2 in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And some countries do have expectedly high numbers, such as Afghanistan and Mexico, but actually one of the highest countries this year for journalist murders has been the United States, with the Capital Gazette killing. Again, many journalists are killed in sort of crossfire or dangerous assignments or war situations. So definitely any country where you have a high level of conflict or a war, there's more likely to be journalists killed there. But in terms of sort of targeted murders and journalists being killed because of what they're reporting on or as a result of what they've reported on, that's the majority of the cases. We have quite a big number from countries like Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. And the U.S. is going to, I think, make the top 3 this year, probably with the Capitol shootings, which killed 5 people. In terms of the number of countries, the countries on the right, this is also from a separate CPJ report that looks at the level of impunity. So that refers to cases where a journalist has been murdered and the people responsible have not been punished for it. And this is their list of all the countries where journalist murders have been conducted or taken out, happened in the past, and where there remains a very high level of impunity. And you'll see that some of the, the expected countries might be on that list, countries that are basically completely in a state of war, like Somalia, Syria, Iraq, but you also have, high-performing democracies such as India, Nigeria, Bangladesh. So there's definitely a range, I think, on that list, and some of it really looks at also the question of the rule of law and how easy it is in a country to bring the perpetrators of a murder to justice. Turning next to one of the other sort of major obvious threats against the media. This is journalists in jail. Again, these numbers are from CPJ. In jailing journalists, whereas sort of the murder of a journalist is the ultimate form of censorship, it sort of ends the journalist's life. Very, very extreme. Jailing journalists is another way to silence the messenger. What we've seen last year is a record number of jailed journalists for the 2nd year. At the end of last year, CPJ will be releasing their numbers for this year in December 1st is usually when they release it. So they conduct an annual census. But last year it was the highest number they'd ever recorded, 262 journalists in jail. As I mentioned before, Turkey is the worst single jailer of journalists. And they have, by CPJ's count, 73 journalists in jail last year. And that's sort of unexpected, but it's tied to this huge crackdown that has started in Turkey 2 years ago in the wake of a coup attempt. If you look at other types of writers and bloggers and academics, the numbers are actually around 140 or 150. So it's a pretty high number of writers of all kinds who are in jail, of which about half are journalists. If you look at the types of laws that are used against journalists, it's a pretty wide range, but the vast majority are imprisoned on anti-state charges, and that could be national security laws, it could be anti-terrorism laws. For example, the Uyghurs in China, an ethnic minority, they're often accused of inciting separatism if they call for rights for their own ethnic group. There is definitely a whole contingent of laws where criminal libel or criminal defamation laws are used against journalists for either printed or online or verbal expression. And this has been a huge uptick actually in Myanmar, a country that I've been doing a lot of work on. Where both journalists and also individual citizens are being prosecuted for comments either that, they might happen in a news article, but in most cases actually it's happening for online speech. So it could be someone making a comment on Facebook, it could be someone making a tweet. Someone was just jailed for 7 years in Myanmar for writing a critical comment on Facebook about on-site censorship. So it's definitely a worrying trend in terms of extending some of those laws into the online realm as well. And then what we also see is non-media charges. So sometimes to make it look like it's not a charge that's related to the journalist's work, what happens is authorities will try and charge them with drug trafficking or with tax evasion or some other crime which seemingly is not related, but which is used sort of as an excuse to silence the journalists. Sentences are often disproportionately long and compared to what the severity of the supposed crime would be. And obviously in many countries, prison conditions are not good to begin with, and so people are subject to very difficult prison conditions as well. Last year, there were 3 countries that were responsible for just over half of the total of the world's jailed journalists. And as I mentioned, Turkey was number 1, followed by China and Egypt. So it's definitely a global trend, a worrying trend, and it's one of the main ways now that journalists around the world are being silenced and unable to do their work. I want to talk a little bit next about, in the next few slides, about some of the, I call them sort of less obvious pressures against the media. murders and legal cases are usually the types of things that make the news the most, and then where it's the most sort of obvious threat, but a few of the things coming up are things that I wanted to mention because I felt that they often sort of fly beneath the radar, but they are also very effective ways to silence both journalists and or media outlets as a whole. So in terms of economics, usually this affects not the individual journalists, but it affects the media outlet as a whole. And there are several ways this can happen. In some countries, authorities attempt to break apart media companies. They try to revoke licenses, for example, either from radio or TV, or they try to impose onerous regulatory oversight. So this has happened in countries like Hungary and Venezuela, where they sort of use regulatory mechanisms or ownership mechanisms as a way to sort of change the ownership or constrict the ability of the outlet to do its work. One other tactic that's come up recently is basically the ruling party in different countries working to ensure the capture of outlets by pro-regime owners. So they try and engineer ownership changes in media outlets and ensure that the media outlet is bought by somebody that's close to the government or who will then present pro-government views. Often that is followed by the major journalists or columnists either leaving the paper or getting fired from the paper, and the paper turning over into could be what was a once critical voice turning into basically a pro-government outlet. And this is happening in Turkey with a number of the papers, but it's not confined to Turkey. It's happening in a number of countries. Another very subtle tactic usually is denial of advertising. So what happens here is, in many countries, state advertising is a major part of the advertising market, and the government will refuse to advertise in a critical media outlet. What they can also do is pressure private companies to not advertise in that media outlet either. And so that's a huge economic, crack on a media outlet that is trying to remain in the black. In Pakistan, there was a boycott of one of the major media groups that was critical of the government, and it almost led to that outlet closing down. What often happens then is the media outlet is basically faced with a choice. They can either try to fight the boycott and try to see if they can remain solvent otherwise, or they more often, I would say, tend to temper their coverage and pull back on criticism and decide that in order to stay afloat, they need to toe the line. So that often does not really come to the attention of press freedom groups or people watching these issues. It often goes very far below the radar. The other thing I think, which is more of a long-term trend, but I wanted to mention on the economic side, is just the transformation of the media industry as a whole, based on new sustainability models due to the digital rise. So, the whole model of the news industry is changing and how news outlets make money, and many are struggling to figure out ways to adapt, old business practices to a new environment. What we've seen sort of related to this is, in many countries, the U.S. as well, we've had sort of shutdown of local news outlets in favor of large news conglomerates, which risks sort of having like deserts where there are no local news outlets. It can lead to less diversity of viewpoints and also less coverage of local issues. One of the issues with sort of the more digital realm and internet is that often now it's sort of you can track, let's say how many hits a story gets. So journalists are pushed to write stories based on how many hits they think they will get, or the media outlet thinks they will get. Some journalists are getting paid for the number of hits they get. Media outlets can also have a financial incentive to sort of to try and maximize clicks on the story. So instead of sort of more straight up reporting, I would say, and more in quotes boring reporting, what you see is sort of headlines that are more sensational, trying to pull people in. Often, I would say there's a risk of having a bit less truth and a bit more sensationalism in this sort of race for eyeballs and to maximize profits in the digital realm. What we've also seen is, interestingly, this came up in the last year, the impact of social media platforms such as Facebook. Facebook, there was an interesting change. I don't remember when it happened. I think the end of last year, Facebook decided they were going to change their algorithm and run tests in a number of countries where basically they were going to cut back the amount or the spread of, in many cases it was local or small independent news outlets and bloggers, and the spread that they could get on Facebook on the news feed. So they decided to start playing around with this algorithm in about 6 countries. And the countries range from, I would say, countries with partly free media environments. There was also Cambodia, which is already a not free country, and where there are very few independent outlets to begin with. And what we saw in Cambodia is that these few independent voices were basically, their whole reach was shot overnight. They were not able to get the message out to people on Facebook. People were not seeing the news articles anymore. And in a pre-election environment where things were very heated, and you would think that the diversity of news would be quite important, these voices were being silenced. So it is interesting looking at the impact sometimes that sort of business decisions and changes on these platforms, could be Google, could be Facebook, can have on the ability of small independent news outlets just to reach out and get their news stories seen. Another, I think, more hidden threat and pressure against media and journalists these days concerns online harassment. This is a growing problem around the world. Some of my colleagues at Penn earlier this year worked on an online harassment field manual for journalists and writers, which basically show a lot of the different forms that online harassment takes, including doxing, threats of violence, impersonation online. And they sort of pulled writers and journalists to look at what the impact of being harassed online was. And some of these were journalists who write for major outlets but who have an online presence on Twitter, for example, or on Facebook, and the impact that online harassment was having. So 37% of the writers said that they had started to avoid certain topics because they were afraid of the harassment they received. 64% they said that they took a break from social media and just cut back on posting on these platforms. It was predominantly skewed against both women and writers of color, so certain communities are being more affected by online harassment. Many writers reported feeling very alone or unsure when to report harassment to law enforcement. And definitely it's a huge problem in the US, but it is a global phenomenon. In some countries, governments encourage supporters to sort of attack and harass people online. We've seen this in India with sort of a troll army affiliated with the ruling party that will go after anyone who makes critical comments. And some governments actually use paid trolls to attack critical media outlets or journalists or commentators or influencers. So that's in many countries, but I gave Azerbaijan, Nigeria, and Russia as examples of that. So definitely what we see is that it is a growing trend against writers and journalists who have an online presence, and that it is leading to self-censorship on these platforms and an unwillingness to engage in that space. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about another sort of insidious pressure, misinformation and fake news. Penn produced a report in 2017 where we tried to look at both at the trend of fake news and look at ways to sort of deal with it and what could be done. Looking at it from a free expression lens, because one of the things you don't want to do is encourage censorship while you're trying to fight fake news. In terms of the Penn definition, we tried to define it as demonstrably false information that's being presented as a factual news report with the intention to deceive the public. And what we've seen is fake news stories can inflame political, ethnic, or religious tensions and weaken healthy discourse. And this is, again, happening a lot in the US, so you've probably heard about it in that context, but it is also a global phenomenon as well. There's been a lot of focus on fake news, for example, in Myanmar and in South Asia and a number of other countries. So looking at the threat, I mean, obviously the circulation of fake news can misinform, it can polarize populations, and in the most extreme cases, it can lead to actual violence, either against individuals or against whole ethnic groups. Additionally, which is a little bit more insidious, the trend of political leaders around the world calling coverage from established news organizations as fake news can deteriorate trust in the media and also can lead to people questioning truth as a concept altogether. And we've seen rhetoric, obviously, in the US about fake news coming from the president, but we've also seen a number of other leaders around the world using pretty much the same rhetoric. So, you know, presidents in Cambodia, Hungary, the Philippines, many other examples are using the same rhetoric to denigrate the press as a whole. And usually it's directed against critical or, you know, critical news outlets rather than anything that's demonstrably fake. So the challenge is, how do we address it? How do we address this challenge without threatening the press? The Penn report is, I would say, really good at laying out a whole lot of solutions and possibilities. So if anyone's really interested in this topic, I would encourage you to go to the Penn website and read the executive summary. But my colleagues at Penn came up with a lot of E words to describe what to do. Educate, equip, exemplify, engage, expose, and empower. So one really important thing is to educate news consumers in media literacy, equipping readers to recognize fake news, and also understanding how quality journalism works and what biases may or may not be inherent due to ownership or staff of the media outlet. Media outlets also need to exemplify quality journalistic practices, and social media platforms and aggregators such as Google or Facebook need to engage with the public more and offer greater transparency about the policies that they are currently undertaking. There has been a big focus by these companies to, in quote, you know, deal with the problem of fake news. But the question is how to do this in a way that is not, for example, censoring whole, you know, ranges of content, you know, whole news outlets, things like that, and striking a balance between dealing with what is a very serious problem, but also doing it in a way which preserves and promotes free expression rights. I'll turn now to a couple of the cases that Penn and I have worked on in particular, just to try and highlight a little bit about some of the, you know, the individual cases and some of the individual stories and examples of what happens in journalists being at risk and put in jail in different cases. All of these are cases I've worked on personally, extensively. The current one right now in Myanmar is one that I've been working on for the last 10 months. So I can definitely talk a lot about that. I was just in Myanmar a couple weeks ago, meeting, and they are, the two journalists remain in jail. They've been in jail for months. They were convicted almost 2 months ago. I met with their lawyer, I met with their family members. So it's a case that's very, very close to my heart, and we are trying to get them out of jail right now, but it's definitely a difficult case. They were basically investigating this massacre around this time last year, and I would say from September to December, and they had not yet published a story on the massacre, but clearly the police knew that they were investigating and were close to gathering a lot of information. So they were arrested in December. They were held incommunicado for several weeks. Their family members did not know where they were. Finally, on the 10th of January, they were charged with violating the Official Secrets Act, which was an act that was basically passed during the British colonial period and is very broad and restrictive in terms of classifying large amounts of information as a potential official secrets. They had, in fact, been investigating a massacre in a village in Rakhine State. Reuters eventually published the story in February with the permission of the two journalists. And they were subject to about, at least 6 months of pre-trial hearings that went on every week. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor, every week they were taken from the jail to the courtroom. And there was, one or two witnesses was brought forward and gave evidence. That time during the week was the only time when their families were able to see them. So it was very emotional, and it was sort of a weekly hearing. Reuters has been very, very supportive of the case and has been supporting the families and supporting them, doing everything they can to draw awareness to the case. And it's also been a case that's, I would say, has gotten quite a lot of attention in the international press and from the international community. So there has actually been a lot of advocacy and work on the case to try and get them out. Despite all this, on September 3rd, they were found guilty. Basically, the entire trial has been riddled with sort of procedural errors. Police admitted that the two men had been set up. There were inconsistent testimony from witnesses. There was a lot of problems with the trial and the evidence, but despite that, there was this guilty verdict. So they've been sentenced to 7 years in prison. Chasu, who's on the right of that picture, has now a 3-year-old daughter, who you saw in the video. Walon, his wife, basically found out she was pregnant right around the time that he was taken into prison. She gave birth to a baby in August, and he still has not had a chance to see his new baby. But we are hoping it might happen this weekend on Saturday, because they have been given a space in the courtrooms, or the prison to see. So hopefully his wife wrote to me yesterday, and she's hoping that he's finally going to meet his new baby daughter on Saturday. I got to meet his baby daughter when I went there a couple weeks ago, which was very bittersweet. So this is a case that we are working very hard on right now to try and push the government in whatever way possible. There has been a lot of outcry, both by, pretty widely from the U.S. administration, Vice President Pence, the Congress, the State Department, many UN officials have spoken out about it. We're trying to organize a big letter with all the major human rights organizations signing on to ask. Basically, one of the main ways to get them out right now is to get a presidential pardon, which happens to be the best way often in a lot of the political prisoner cases to win a release. So that's what a lot of us are focusing on right now. So hopefully this is going to end well and soon. Also still in jail, despite the fact that he was technically let out in September. Shakan is his nickname. Mahmoud Abu Zaid is his real name. He is a jailed photojournalist in Egypt. In his mid-20s, he was a freelance photojournalist. And he was basically trying to take pictures of a protest. And he was arrested with and alongside hundreds of others who were the actual protesters in August 2013. So he's been detained for 5 years in unsanitary conditions. Prosecutors requested the death penalty in the case for pretty much everyone, and I think there were upwards of 700 defendants in this case, most of whom were the actual protesters. He and a few other people involved in the case were the journalists who were trying to take pictures of the protest. And this went on all summer. There were I think at least 3 or 4 times when we thought he might be given the death penalty, and then the trial was postponed or the sentencing was postponed. Finally, in September, we had good news that he wasn't exonerated, but he was given a 5-year sentence. And given that he's already been in jail for 5 years, technically that means they should have let him out in September. But he has not been let out yet, and no one really can figure out why, given the judgment in September. But we are continuing to try and push for him to be let out of jail. But yeah, a young 20-something-year-old guy who was taking pictures at a protest has been let in jail for trying to do a good job. This is a case I was working on a few years ago. We awarded Khadija Ismailova our same award that the Reuters journalists have gotten. My first year at Penn, which is in 2015. And she was an intrepid investigative reporter with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and other outlets. And she specialized in reporting on official corruption. She was arrested for that, and then hers is one of these cases where rather than charging her with a journalistic-related crime, she was charged with inciting a colleague to commit suicide, which made absolutely no sense. And then when they realized they couldn't, they couldn't make those charges stick, they tried to charge her with a variety of economic crimes, including sort of tax evasion, financial irregularities, about 6 different charges. She was finally released. There was a lot of pressure on her case by, again, a very wide range of human rights and press freedom groups. She was finally released in May 2016, but she has been since subject to a travel ban, so she isn't allowed to leave the country. And she's been in high demand to speak at conferences and talk about issues of the press in Azerbaijan. But her mother was also dying and was in Turkey, and she was unable to go and see her mother before her mother died of cancer. last year. So it's a pretty significant personal toll. She's also experienced, both before and after the imprisonment, she's experienced online harassment, covert video surveillance of her personal life. The government basically set up and made a tape of her having sex with her boyfriend and then tried to blackmail her to stop her journalistic work. So it's been a pretty wide-ranging level of harassment against her. And she is, like Azerbaijan's probably preeminent and foremost journalist, so you can see that, she has the profile I want to come down on that. But this is another case where she was let out of jail, so it's a good situation, but in terms of her being fully free or able to do her work, she still is not. She is, as you can see, working on her computer in Azerbaijan, but she's not, I would say, in a fully free situation, able to do her work. She does what she can. Finally, I'd like to end my talk just focusing on Jamal Khashoggi. This is a case that's been in the news right now, so probably most of you have heard of this. And he was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. I did not know him personally, but I know a number of people who knew him, including his editor at the Washington Post. So I'm sort of one step removed from this case. And it's a particularly gruesome and horrific case, but I think, his case really, and his writing sort of, I think, both I wanted to end with this quote from him on the right, which I'll read in a minute, but I felt that this was from his last column at the Washington Post, which actually his assistants sent in to them shortly after he disappeared, and they held off publishing until last week. And ironically, the whole title and the theme of his article is about how the Arab world needs free expression. So I'll read it, hopefully you can see it. But as a result, Arabs living in these countries are either uninformed or misinformed. They are unable to adequately address, much less publicly discuss, matters that affect the region and their day-to-day lives. The state-run narrative dominates the public psyche, and while many do not believe it, a large majority of the population falls victim to this false narrative. Sadly, this situation is unlikely to change. So I really felt that he was very good at encapsulating both the situation, as well as highlighting the importance of free expression and journalism as a means to reform, broader political reform. His murder is also a particularly gruesome example of the danger that can befall those who attempt to speak truth to power. And although it's particularly gruesome and it's gotten a lot of attention, there are many other journalists whose names no one really knows who are equally trying to push back against the boundaries and who end up, again, murdered, and no one knows their name. So his case is, it's good that it's in the, public sphere and is really drawing attention to some of these issues for the broader public, not just those of us like me who spend our days focusing on these types of cases. But yeah, I wanted to end with a bit of a tribute to him and a sort of, I think his case sort of encapsulates a lot of the issues that I've been trying to highlight today, and also some of obviously the continuing and very brave and broad threats to journalists and media around the world. So I will end there on a sad note. It is a pretty grim situation, I will say, but there are also bright spots, so I'm happy to talk about some of those. In the Q&A, I'm also happy to talk about sort of what groups like me and groups like the groups that I work for are doing about the situation, what journalists are trying to do. I'm happy to answer any other questions about anything I talked about or anything you have on your minds or any country you want to know about. I used to be better at answering the country questions when I worked at Freedom House, but I can do my best. So yeah, any questions at all, I'm completely open, and I'd love to have more of a discussion. So,
well, thank you.
That's
very much. One of the things that I think probably you see even more than we do is the great irony in all of this is when a government seeks to silence a journalist, they actually amplify their voice. And I think this is while a lot of people would not have known of Khashoggi or the Reuters journalists before they imprisoned them, or in this case, murdered them, they suddenly became household names. And so I think it's one of the great, as I said, extraordinary twists that in attempting to silence, they gave them even more of a voice than they could have ever imagined when they're alive. I'm sure you see that a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's actually great. The Washington Post has done a wonderful job at really trying to push his voice out there and make sure the case is not getting lost. But you know, there are many other cases where those voices are silenced. But there's some interesting, I think, attempts to try to get around that. The whole idea of sort of silencing the messenger by murdering a journalist. People are trying to work beyond that. So for example, in Mexico, I know of projects where other journalists, both based in Mexico and based in the US, are trying to take the stories that were being worked on by people who get murdered and then finish the story and keep it going. There's also a really interesting project, actually, that Khadija is involved with from Azerbaijan, in trying to work with investigative reporters throughout the entire Eurasia and Balkans and Europe region to like cooperate on stories and to finish each other's stories. So there was a Maltese journalist, Daphne Caruana Galiziano, who was murdered last year, and many colleagues are now trying to finish some of her stories and track all the linkages in organized crime that she was reporting on. So there are some really interesting and positive ways in which journalists are trying to push back against this, and also work on sort of cross-border initiatives. The Panama Papers was another example of sort of a cross-border investigative journalist initiative. But those things are, but the whole idea behind it, I would say, is this idea that you know, governments believe that if they murder a journalist, they will also kill the story. And so the idea about this is to show that they cannot kill the story. Hopefully then it means they may not also. We'll see.
I have some questions for you, but I'll hold off because it's more important that they're asked by this group. So if anyone wants to get us started, Gabe, I see. Please go ahead.
Something that sort of, I'll just say this. To my knowledge, a large part of Freedom House's budget comes from the CIA, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is mostly paid for by the United States government. Do you believe that these factors influence their coverage of international events, though, or create some sort of bias, possibly a pro-U.S. or pro-Western bias in their reporting?
Well, the Freedom House budget is mostly from the U.S. government, but it's not the CIA. It's mostly the State Department and USA.
Right.
So it's not, to my knowledge, they've never gotten money from the CIA.
I was a little mixed up there.
Okay, so most of it is sort of international development money that's State Department grants or U.S. Agency for International Development, which does economic development but also works on political, mostly, I would say, democracy promotion, press freedom, human rights. So yeah, the majority of the Freedom House budget does remain government money, U.S. government and money from other governments, but it's not the CIA.
All right.
And I think if it had been, I would have heard about it during my 14 years there. But basically, I would say though, just, you know, that's a quick corrective, but when I worked at Freedom House, basically the money they get from the U.S. government, I would say, does not affect the programming and the type of programming the work they do. And when there were pushes by the State Department to try and restrict the type of work Freedom House did using the money, Freedom House pushed back. So most of the funding is used to help train and protect human rights defenders, journalists, people working on women's rights, people working on religious freedom, people working on LGBT rights. And whenever there were sort of attempts to restrict or to, you know, direct programming, Freedom House did always push back, and they actually pulled out they pulled back from receiving funding if they felt that their liberty to design programs and do it in a way that was safe for the people they worked with was constrained. So I would say no, and actually, but on a related point, the programmatic work of Freedom House, which is mostly U.S. government funded, and the research side of Freedom House, which I worked for in New York, and which was actually completely privately funded, were two completely separate pools of people, and there was pretty much a firewall between the two. So our, you know, the ratings and the research and the analysis that was done on these projects had pretty much no, you know, interplay or relation to the programmatic work, and it's conducted by you know, researchers, professors, journalists, experts in countries and subject matter. It was reviewed by wide committees of different experts, so there was really no way that, any influence from the US government or from any other government would have crept in. There was pretty rigorous level of analysis. I actually, just on a related note, I found at Freedom House that actually some of the private donors we had were more, tried to impose more conditions on us than the US government. So it's not only government money that can come with preconditions. If you have a private foundation or a rich individual, they can sometimes impose more conditions on the funding than the US government or any other government. Hope that answers your question.
Let me ask you, you were talking about your work in Myanmar. So we have this phrase in the human rights sector, name and shame, right? This idea that at some point taking the government to task. So, and you've also talked about the work in Myanmar, some of it has been a little bit more under the radar that you've been doing. So what goes into the calculation of going all out, loud, critical, to just do the megaphone around the world and to try to keep it under the radar? Is there something over the years you've been doing this work that it's a tipping point, okay, now we have to get very public with this?
I think each case is slightly different. When you work on, you sort of get a sense, you have to figure out what the pressure points are and who you could advocate for, and whether there may be sort of back channels, or whether it is more useful and effective to do very public naming and shaming, or sort of have diplomats talking behind the scenes, let's say, to their counterparts. So usually when we're trying to design, more public campaigning or advocacy, we try to do it in conjunction with a range of different human rights groups. We try to talk to local partners on the ground, local journalists, local human rights experts. We also try to talk to diplomats, so usually I've gone to the US Embassy and talked to them and tried to see if, for example, if they say like, oh, well, we have some good back channels and we're making progress with talking to these officials about it, and it looks like they're going to get close to releasing this person, but they don't want to lose face, so they don't want a lot of it in the public eye, then we might hold that. Similarly with this case, because the legal process was going on, we were actually running into a situation where we wanted to do more public advocacy, and Reuters did not want us to do as much advocacy because they wanted to sort of see how the legal process would play out. So they were being very hesitant. And it was frustrating because we had tried to arrange sort of very high-level meetings for the family members of the journalists who had come over to the US. And we had gotten Vice President Pence to agree to a meeting with them. And then Reuters actually pulled back and said, no, we don't want such a high-level meeting. And it turned out that then there was a bad, decision in their case. And now we're back in a situation of trying to push and have a high level of advocacy. But it's, I think reaching out and talking to a wide variety of people is always very helpful on a case, trying to figure out where the pressure points might be, and when's a good time to push or not to push. So we try and confer pretty widely before we do that. Right now, as I said, the main avenue seems to be a pardon from the technical president, but Aung San Suu Kyi, who's the state counselor, sort of holds a lot of, the power. So the question is like, who potentially could get to her and change her mind, which is a difficult question. No one really knows. And she is also facing, sort of constraints from the military. So we're trying to figure out sort of the best ways to do it. What we're trying to do right now, which I'm working on actually, is a big letter by a lot of the human rights groups, sort of pointing out that all of these groups that once supported her are now criticizing her for basically keeping other people in jail, in a very similar position to her own case when she was kept in the same jail that they're not being kept in. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be a tough case because of the subject matter they were covering, but I would say confer widely and trying to take a lot of input and expertise from the country that you're trying to advocate in is very important, and not just making decisions from here, but reaching out and talking to local experts in Myanmar and talking to diplomats is very, very helpful as you try to figure out the best way.
Yeah. And then going off the video that you had, the Penn was making the argument, so it follows from the previous question, that so many journalists, as a result of our very public campaigns, have been released. So why do governments do that? And this is something I always talk about with my students in my law and human rights classes, but what is in it for a country like Myanmar, the wheels move in such a way, but previous cases where you have seen success, what is it about it that suddenly they're willing to make a change?
I mean, usually I think governments, in many of these cases, they're trying to, cover up stories, and it's, they take one case and they imprison 2 people, but the impact on the industry is huge. So when I just went to Myanmar, I asked other journalists about the impact of the case, and they said, we're not going to cover certain stories anymore. We're scared because we think we can be thrown in jail as well. I mean, they kept changing the evidence against these guys, but one of the final pieces was that Wallone on his cell phone had the phone number of the leader of this rebel group. Now, many journalists in Myanmar have the phone numbers of leaders of rebel groups on their phone because they talk to them to try and get stories about, ethnic conflict and articles they're covering. So many journalists there are like, that could be me. I could be put in jail for the same evidence, and so they are self-censoring now. They're not wanting to cover certain stories. So that's always the impetus of the government. And they'll do it if they can try to get away with it, to keep these stories under wraps. I think what we try and do with our advocacy is, and other similar groups, is you try and basically make it harder for them to keep the journalists in their jail than to release them. So if there's so much international attention, if there's so much pressure, if they're getting asked about this case at every international meeting they go to and getting embarrassed about it, then we're hoping that they will release these guys. Now the impact is still probably going to be more self-censorship, but at least these guys will be out of jail. So you're always trying to change the balance and make it harder for them to keep people in jail than they are to release them. So.
And I think students, a lot of people are very surprised that governments don't like to be embarrassed. I mean, it's something that as campaigners can play to. If you think that they would be like Teflon, nothing would bother them, but they really, the overall calculus is they don't like to be embarrassed.
I mean, some governments probably won't be embarrassed, and for example, it's very hard for us to do any type of advocacy with China because on some level, like, Chinese president doesn't care. But in countries where they are more worried about their international, their image, Myanmar, for example, it's the broader crackdown on the Rohingya population in general, but it has had an impact on tourism, it's had an impact on economics, it's had an impact on investment, so they are seeing that there's a bad impact for the country as a whole. So that can be helpful as well. So if they see that there's a bad impact. There is also a really interesting law that I know the former president of Freedom House and others were involved in trying to pass, and it's actually one which has been invoked now in the Khashoggi case for the first time, but it's called the Global Magnitsky Act, and that basically would allow the U.S. government to impose sanctions or other restrictions on officials or individuals who have been or not convicted, but sort of there's a high level of evidence required, but if they've been found to be involved in a human rights abuse, including the murder of a journalist, they could be slapped with sanctions, it could be a visa ban, it could be a travel ban, it could be that their assets are seized. And that's been a good law that was passed, but it's a very high standard, so it isn't invoked very often. But actually, the Bipartisan Committee of Congress, 2 weeks ago, they sent a letter to the administration saying, we want you to investigate this case, and if you find the people involved, you have to do something. So there are some mechanisms that can be used to try and ensure accountability. Even from the U.S., the Europeans have similar laws as well. So there are some mechanisms that can be used to push governments. And many of these leaders want to be able to travel to the U.S. and Europe. They own property here. They send their kids to college here. So the level of economic sanctions or a visa ban does have a big impact on a country like that. So it is actually a very effective way to try and ensure accountability if it's used properly.
Other questions?
It's just like a broad question, but do you think censorship will just continue to get worse, or what would some solutions be?
Honestly, what I've seen is when you look back at the 80s and 90s, there was much more direct censorship. So in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of censorship. What we're seeing now, I think, is is less overt censorship and more, what we see now is like, more subtle forms, so like misinformation, fake news, like putting other news out there. You don't need to censor the news, you just have to flood the news environment with so much other stuff that, people can't even find the news anymore. Likewise, I mean, yeah, so I think that governments are getting more clever about, not just, in some places they do use censorship, they'll cut down the internet, or they'll block newspapers from being published, or they'll, turn off TV broadcasts. But in many other places it's much more subtle and it's harder to actually see. And so that, I think, is what we're seeing, both on the, particularly in the online realm, but also in the sort of traditional print and broadcast media realm as well, is more a sort of manipulation of content rather than censorship or outright blockage.
And do you think that sort of goes along with what I've sort of read about as a sort of a rising term in political theory, the rise in less overt, there are fewer probably overt dictatorships than there used to be, but there's a lot more what's known as hybrid regimes?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what we've seen is sort of less overt control over the media, so in terms of, the countries where there's basically, almost complete state ownership, let's say, of all the broadcast and print media, that number of countries is very, very small. What we see is a much broader range in the middle, where, there could be the appearance of private media outlets, but, if they're all owned by friends of the president, there's not really much media diversity, or you're probably not going to get a lot of critical voices. So in those countries, I would say there's the appearance of a free media or media diversity, but if you really dig in and you look behind the scenes, or you look at, some of these economic pressures, if you look at levels of self-censorship, then you see that the media environment is not really free at all or diverse. And so there's this appearance, but it's not actually a situation of free and diverse media. So I would agree. I think the countries where you can really say, oh, there's this complete level of control and censorship are, probably less than 20 in the world, maybe even 10. But if you look at all the countries in the middle, there's a huge range where there's significant barriers to media freedom, but there's the illusion of freedom and diversity.
Thank you very much for all of this. So much to think about and to work with. So we're going, if you have any individual questions of Dr. Deutsch Karlekar, please feel free to come up. You can see she's very approachable. And in a couple of minutes, we'll switch gears to more informal job talk and work in this area. We've already gotten some hints at some of the things and how that works in a few minutes. All right, thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest.